surfaced. And it surfaced, in fact, when Jacques Jacquemin wrote his purported debt virus after writing me about a paper which is called Parable of Perfect Economy. Now, an interesting further thing in regard to this Parable of Perfect Economy is that, excuse me, I originally started telling it in 1975 as a vehicle for teaching. And in this story, I have Benjamin Franklin explaining mathematically perfected economy in the case of a community and two agricultural producers, one who raises chickens or fowl, and the other of whom raises feed. From there, the story goes into in the story, Franklin's challenged by the British aristocracy over there to explain that this idea is preposterous. How would you fund government with this mere scrip? That is, in the story, just as we've suggested in our previous explanations, the right to issue promissory obligations is just simply exercised by the people. And this is another thing I didn't finish saying. I'll just quickly add this point. At this point, the thing that these von Mises and people and Austrian economists and all the advocates of the banking system are saying when they say currency has to be privatized totally excludes the only right way to privatize it, because none of this money ever exists unless it's by issuance of an individual or individuals' own promissory obligations. All the banking system does is intervene upon that natural right, and the actual fact that that's the only thing that's creating the money is these people agreement to issue a promissory obligation. The bank simply obfuscates it into a debt to itself and multiplies that debt by interest eventually and inevitably into a terminal sum of insoluble debt. Well, so the actual only right way to privatize it is to restore the right of the individual to issue their promissory obligations free of exploitation through such a vehicle as the common monetary foundry that I suggest. So these people, in arguing that it be private, are only arguing that it be private for the sake of exploitation. They're not arguing that it be a private right, which it is. It's each of our rights to engage in or to refrain from issuing a promissory obligation. But it's also the only legitimate ways of monetizing our production. And there's a reason that a promissory note or obligation is the only plausible vehicle for monetizing our wealth, as opposed to this idea that money can't be a debt. And that is that every unit of circulation must be bound to an obligation to retire it from circulation, or its existence is inflationary. Another thing that's wrong with this idea that money can't be a debt is that if we eliminate the credit that is the product of a promissory obligation, we deny ourselves tremendous potential prosperity. For example, say a couple, they're 20 years old each, get married, and their incomes can readily afford the $83.33 a month that it would cost to pay for a $100,000 home with a 100-year lifespan. You know, they can readily afford that. But if money can never be a debt, they would have to save potentially their whole lives, all the while then further jeopardizing their circumstances and potential to do that saving, because they would be at the mercy of landlords who might charge exorbitant rents or whatever. But in any case, nonetheless, even despite any other possible factor whatsoever, by denying them a right to issue promissory obligations, which they can readily afford, which we can readily certify their creditworthiness in regard to, and which we can even enforce, because under mathematically perfected economy, the remaining value of the property is always sufficient to recoup and eliminate any possible loss. We deny them the ability to do this. They have to save their whole life until they might save $100,000 to do this. Worse, the only means of introducing circulation then are, as people are saying, spending it into circulation. This implies that if you're doing this to fund government, for instance, that the size of the government has to be the same size of the volume of circulation you need. You don't have any means of retiring circulation if you claim and abide by this assertion that it's only a debt. Therefore, you have to retire it from circulation in some other way. And when I bring this up, the people regularly say, well, there is a way. It's called taxation. All right. Then you agree that there has to be an obligation to pay every unit out of circulation. Who is that obligation naturally incumbent upon but the person who consumes of it? Therefore, you restore the very definition of a promissory obligation, in which the obligor is obligated under mathematically perfected economy to at least abide by this obligatory schedule of payment, which, without even any regulation, automatically maintains an inflation and deflation free circulation. Who else should pay for this debt, I ask them? Well, they never have an answer other than the obligor. And of course, there are some exceptions where we might, for instance, pay into some fund that's, but willingly, of our own volition, which might be a charity of some kind, for instance. But generally, the only just pattern is that the people that decide even to do that are the consumers then of the expense. So when this money is spent into circulation, it is not truly ever spent into circulation if in fact we end up solving both inflation and deflation, because there is no way to do so but by binding to every unit an obligation to pay it out of circulation and retire the principal at the rate of consumption by whoever consumes it. So all that's really happened is that these people have deviated somehow. Now, let's examine the consequences of both propositions. Money can't be a debt, or money is a natural, unexploited promissory obligation, as it is in mathematically perfected economy. What are the overall costs to us? Neither impose any cost, except in the case of the claim that money can't be a debt, because you have to have administration deciding, and monitoring the circulation and the remaining value of wealth, and somehow adjusting it by taxation, which may or may not be applied to the people who ought to be paying for what's ever being consumed or depreciated. By disassociating all this from the things which it's naturally associated to, you only pave the way for injustice, and you're doing this with a far greater requirement of bureaucracy. In fact, the government, in many cases of people's ideas of implementing this, the government would have to be constantly of the size of whatever circulation sustains anything else, and still we can't fund any further enterprise or endeavors but by saving from a circulation which actually represents some other wealth, the value of the government, by saving enough until we can do this. So debts are very important to us, especially credible debts that can be enforced. Now, what is the overall cost in either case? It's exactly the same. Mathematically perfected economy doesn't impose a penny of further cost. In fact, it eliminates all the costs of the bureaucracy, which is attempting to accomplish the same objects by and is increasing its cost by abandoning this vital principle that every unit has to be paid out of circulation, and that it is rightfully only paid out of circulation by those who commit to it. You see? So it's on the one hand nothing more than a delusion that money can't be a debt if we're going to solve inflation and deflation. On the other hand, you're not saving anything by doing so. And on a third hand, you're obstructing yourselves from financing all the vast further prosperity that is possible if and only if we allow ourselves to monetize our production by the same thing, spending the money into circulation indeed, but in conjunction with an obligation to pay for the thing that we receive for it, and must pay at least at the rate of consumption or depreciation in order to eradicate, not only to eradicate inflation and deflation, but to do so even without any regulation whatsoever, because then our accounting system accomplishes the same object of this gargantuan bureaucracy that you might have if money is just spent into circulation and all these things are adjusted somehow so they're right, which adjustment would amount to mathematically perfected economy, because the people who should be paying for it are the people who consume of what they've committed to. Simple as that. So in effect, there is no such thing as simply spending money into circulation if you are solving inflation and deflation. And mathematically perfected economy solved all these issues 43 years ago. So I ask, Bill Stills, who is he to pretend that he's pursuing solutions when he knows full well who I am, when he's borrowed my very words in his Money Masters video, when Ellen Hodgson Brown is now claiming the very things that she was, denying existed as problems because I proved her wrong, And the mark of the plagiarists is the fact that they deny that I exist. They never even mention me. And they only have to go to my web pages to see that, or have a discussion with me to see that these things have already been solved. Every issue is already solved. So in the end, this comes down to, in regard to you, so where does this put all these students who are studying banking? Is there actually even an opportunity for them to persist in this marketplace that you imagine, that government's going to create the money and effectively banks then are going to loan it into circulation subject to interest, and this marketplace is going to put borrowers and lenders together? Well, see, in my concept, that opportunity doesn't even exist, because an entrepreneur always knows what they need. And if they can finance it without extrinsic cost under mathematically perfected economy, they're never even in need of impeding their rights to free enterprise, that is just reward for their production, by involving a purported investor who's not creating the money, the money isn't their own property, yet here again we would be assuming that interest is justified, though it's not even the property of the bank. If it was the property of government, which it's not, the government then would just be publishing evidence of our promissory obligations to each other. So the government doesn't deserve interest, but it's not even the property of the bank. They're just seeing after the lending it into circulation. That doesn't justify interest. It isn't their property. There's nothing at risk. They're not producing anything. And the fact of the matter is, the entrepreneur always knows what they need. And what happens is, when we resort to what we call investment, is under a depleted circulation, we are more or less the entrapped prey or hosts of a parasitic situation in which the need for further circulation, in conjunction with a still persistent denial of our right to issue our promissory obligations without exploitation, those two things together make us go to the same people who, if they charge interest for money, are going to engender the same effect. So that's another thing I intended to explain to you, that it just won't work. And you could apply my same models, the same models I provided the Reagan